Hi, this is Gabby Berman, and this is my audio reading log for the book Cahokia. I just read the first two chapters, so I just wanted to share my thoughts about it. I thought it was really interesting how it started off with the morning star and how the native people thought it was like a god and even like personified them, the star, and how it was like the evening star was a feminine god but the morning star was a masculine. I just thought that was super interesting. Another thing I thought was interesting was how it just like seemed like all of the sudden this new Cahokian city was just there and like so influential. I thought it was very interesting that it only took them like a year to become this influential, and how they even had some like things that we still do today, like the team sports and the things like that. I also thought it was interesting how big that city was, and how it like went from being a bunch of little individual tribes and like villages to this one big like city almost, even though it's not a city. And even reading the description of it, it says it's a big city, but it was just only 3 to 5 square miles, which to us that seems super small now, but to them that would have been really big because all of the people were moving from like different areas. Another thing with that is that people were hearing about it from all over and coming to see what was going on. Like it said, people in what would have been New York now were even hearing about it, this city on the Mississippi and Missouri. Like it's just so interesting that it traveled that far so long ago when there wasn't the technology that we have now to like learn about it. Another thing I thought was interesting was the supernova and how we can't tell if it actually played a role in this big reset of everything, but how, if it affected everything or not, how almost coincidental that this is, if it did have something to do with it or didn't. It was just so cool that people back then used to like look at the skies, and the fact that there was a supernova that close is very cool because they obviously would pay a lot of attention to the sky, so them seeing a supernova would definitely change things or make them think about what was going on and ask or be confused or maybe even scared because it was a new star that was super bright that they could see day and night. I also thought it was really cool how at the beginning of chapter 2 it said that it had all these different regions of places like in Europe or Asia or Africa that were all pretty different, but they were all trading with each other still, even with all of their differences. I guess it's still like today, but like just the fact that they could do it back then when they didn't have the technology that we have today is really cool, because it shows how they wanted to like get along and trade, because it took a lot of effort for them to do that, probably, since they didn't have, like I said, the technology we have today, so it would have taken a lot more time for them to do that. I also thought something was interesting was one line towards the end of chapter 1. It said there was a darker side to Cahokia's expansion, some might have experienced it as an unstoppable new threat. That's also another way to look at the new city of Cahokia. Some people might have been living there already and just got kicked out of their land, or neighboring villages or towns might have seen it as a threat because they would come and try to take over where they were. I just thought that was definitely a different perspective, which was kind of cool to see. So yeah, those are my thoughts on chapters 1 and 2. Okay, so I just read chapter 3, and the first thing I noticed was how it started in modern times, like, and what we could see now, and then, like, worked its way back in time, saying what they saw in the 1800s, and then saying what someone would see if they were walking to Cahokia at the time of its existence. I thought this was super cool and like a really cool way to lay out the chapter, because at the beginning it said that a lot of the mounds or pyramids were getting destroyed by either humans or erosion or both combined, and then like saying what Brackenridge saw when he explored, and how he saw a majority of the mounds, but even then some of them were not there, and how he was describing them and what they found then. And then it went from there and what he saw to describing what someone walking in that time would see. And I thought it was really cool how they started outside of Cahokia and then worked its way in, and describing like how they could see it from a long ways away when they stood on the mounds, and then like how it went from being like spread out and just like dispersed throughout, and as they got closer it got more and more condensed and packed in almost with people and where they were living. I also thought it was cool how they said, like, described the homes and how they were similar in the places but not the same, and also how they described what the people would most likely have been doing. Like, for one of the houses, they said that the parents would be working on, like, their little chores while the children would be playing. I also thought it was cool how they described how they made the houses, how the floor was dug in so that it could, like, protect the house from the elements, and how they built the house pretty similar to the way the settlers did in the 1800s or 1700s. So yeah, overall I thought it was really cool how the chapter was laid out. I just finished reading chapter 4, and I thought this chapter was really interesting just because of the topic of the game that they were playing. I thought it was really cool how they could tell that that's the game originated before Cahokia, but was like even bigger afterward, or like while Cahokia was in existence. I thought it was super interesting how intense or like big the game was for people, like how into it they got, and how people were betting on it, and how they even involved it in the political side of their like places. Like, for example, they said that people would bet on or gamble about who was gonna win, and they would even give up their freedom as slaves if the team they wanted to win lost, or they would give their wives as like a bet. And then I also thought it was interesting how they found the Cahokian style discs all over. They said that it wasn't until after they weren't created until after 1050 as well. So I thought it was really interesting how we could tell or archaeologists could tell that it was from Cahokia based on how the discs were made, and not, and like just how they could see where everything was from. I also thought it was interesting how the names for each group were similar, which makes sense if they're going off of the same game. I also thought it was interesting how they had the other game where they like fought each other, and they basically said it was like a small war. I thought that was really interesting how people actually wanted to participate in that game and fight basically up and do anything until killing the other person. I thought that was really interesting. So yeah. So I just finished chapter 5, and chapter 5 just was all about the different archaeologists that worked on the Cahokian site, and I just thought it was very interesting and kind of frustrating that people were trying to like bulldoze or destroy these ancient civilizations when there's so much we could learn about the like what was going on thousands of years ago. Maybe not thousands, but a long time ago. Like there was the first time when the one archaeologist had to find the pile of bones for the government to allow him to keep digging, or how they were trying to build the highways, so they had a deadline for what they could do, and even then some of it still got destroyed. So that's just kind of frustrating because there's so much we could learn just from this one ancient city that was buried. So it's frustrating and interesting how people are trying to destroy it, and for like their own benefit, instead of letting archaeologists do their job and dig up the different civilizations and different structures and the mounds that are there, just to see like how people lived or what they were doing in those ancient times. Like the one with the guy who made the hotel, how he only gave them a few months to dig when they found bodies. I think he did give them a little more time, but it definitely could have been a lot more useful if they gave them all the time they needed to figure out everything. And it just seems like it takes a toll on these archaeologists because they're wanting to do their job, but they're under a deadline, or they have to meet a deadline, so they can't do their work as best as they want because they're trying to rush to figure it out. Overall, it just kind of showed how archaeologists have to deal with people like this and trying to do their job well while being under a deadline. I just read chapter 6, and chapter 6 was about what they found at Mound 72. Well, first they talked about how they wanted to get a map because they figured out that this whole city seemed much more planned than the others, like other like tribes and villages that they had seen in other places. So they wanted to create a map of this city to figure out if it was in fact like planned out where each thing would go. I thought that was really interesting how they could tell that based on where everything was located. And once they got the map, it showed that it was in fact planned out. And then they found the old Cahokia under it, which I thought was really cool, how that just solidified what they had thought. And then they talked about all of the like mass burials and the different like grave sites pretty much they found, and how there was like different types, and they could tell when something was like planned or if it was like good or bad. For example, they had the men with the beaded cape or blanket sort of thing that they had. They thought those men were, they couldn't really tell what they were besides adult men. And they were more respected, and it was a proper, nice burial where they wanted to be remembered well. But then they also found near it the bodies of both men and women, and you could tell that they had been killed right before, and it was just a mass killing or execution, or pretty much, and it was like mass violence, like premeditated violence towards them, and you could tell that they had fallen, and even some of them had still been alive when they had died. I just think it's so interesting that they can tell the nature of these people's deaths sometimes based on what they find in the skeletons in these graves. And overall, it's just interesting how much people can tell just from the way people are buried, or like what happened to them while they were still alive. I just finished chapter 7, and that was all about these paintings that they found in a cave in Wisconsin. And it was also about the stories that went along with the paintings. But first they found, a little boy actually found the paintings, which I thought was really cool, how it was just a little boy that found them. And then the archaeologists that went there almost thought that they were fake, like they weren't actually from like years and years ago. But after talking with his colleagues, they thought it was the red horn. And so they have a bunch of stories about the red horn, and like each different like tribe has their own story, or each civilization has its own story, but they all pretty much have the same like setup pretty much. So it's all about pretty much two brothers or two men that are either twins or brothers, and one of them is supposed to be good and one of them is bad, and it just goes, some archaeologists think that these stories come because people try to categorize like different things, so like it would show good and evil, or like different things like that, good and evil, good and bad. But other archaeologists think that it shows that there's a connection to Cahokia, and how all of these stories originated from one place, and then once they moved and branched off, then they like had their own twists or spins on the story to make it a little different, but still having the same like setup. I just think it's really interesting how different people have their different opinions, which you'll have almost anywhere, but even with this, and then finding the paintings in Wisconsin, even though the Cahokia's in Missouri. So I just think it's really interesting how these things move throughout the years and how much they can change. I just finished chapter 8, and one thing that I found interesting was how they said that the ridgetop mounds were almost always found with like skeletized human remains, or like, yeah, skeletons or human remains. And then it also said how they learned 3 different things about, or they've drawn like observations from them. And so the first was that most graves were laid on the surface of old flat top pyramids before being covered and then made into ridgetop. And then the second thing they learned The burials typically included mass interments of corpses, and trenches or pits, and then the piled burials of skeleton parts. So it was usually had a lot more than just one person at a time. There was many people buried all at the same time. And then the last thing was that the bodies of highly regarded people were like buried like with other people, so they were saved until a certain time to be buried. And then they were also buried with different like artifacts and different objects to show their like appreciation. And then another thing I found interesting was how they found that the replacement hypothesis was interesting. So basically they thought that the highly regarded families moved to the like suburbs of the city and basically kicked out the farmers and forced them to move into the city to give the highly regarded people more space. And then, the other thing I found interesting was how women's sacrifices seemed pretty normal back then. So overall, this chapter was a lot, but I thought it was very interesting with all of the things that they found just because of the ridgetop mounds. I just finished chapter 9, and one thing I thought was really cool was how they found a whole like upland like town from Cahokia, and how like what they found, what they ate, and how they could tell from like their trash and what they ate is that they were like peasants compared to the people in Cahokia and that lived in the city. It said that their trash was impressive, and they ate, like, they could tell that they ate more corn, a lot more corn than was normal for a person or healthy for a person. And then they also only ate like small things of meat. And then it also said that they ate their dogs, which was not common for people in Cahokia, but they did it probably because they didn't have a lot of meat options, and so they had to just eat what they could. It said that they were eating small lizards, frogs, snakes, turtles, and rodents, and then they were also eating their dogs. So they were trying to eat whatever they could to stay alive, pretty much. And then another thing I found interesting was that they sacrificed women. They could tell that they were not eating as well as the high status Cahokian people, and then they were also probably picked based on their beauty and how beautiful they were, which is kind of not right, but I guess it was a long time ago. They also might have ruled out high status local women unless they threatened the royal families of Cahokia, which I thought was very interesting, but it makes sense that they would try to take out the competition. So overall, I thought this chapter was pretty interesting based on the different types of people that they found and different towns that they found. Just finished chapter 10, and one thing that I found interesting in chapter 10 was the fact that a lot of archaeologists didn't think that Mesoamericans like had very much influence on Cahokians and like just the other like northern populations, because they didn't find, I thought it was really like interesting how they didn't find any like Mesoamerican artifacts or like anything really deriving from Mesoamerica in the more northern tribes and northern settlements. But then there was a few people who did think that they were derived from there. And part of the reason people didn't think Mesoamerica had influence was because of the like distance and how far it was. But then the people that thought that it was influential, Mesoamerica was influential, said that they could have easily just gone by boat through the Gulf of Mexico and followed the water like upwards. And then they also another thing I found interesting was the different knives they found that seemed to be mass produced, and how they said the like hero twins, the Red Hawk, I believe, that I mentioned before, that story, they sometimes represented them as knives, and these knives were mass produced alongside chipped stone hoe blades and axe heads and other different things like that. I just thought it was interesting how they could tell that they were mass produced because of like the number that they found and the different like, they even said that the production of these knives was almost an industry for them. So I just think it's really interesting how they were able to gather enough resources to be able to mass produce these knives. Overall, this chapter was pretty interesting. I just thought it was really cool how there was disagreements about whether Mesoamerica was influential or not. I just read chapter 11, and one thing that I found interesting was the whole rock map thing that Norris found. I thought it was funny how he joked about how he was good at finding the like one or singular archaeological discoveries. Like he found the buried arrowheads, and then he found the French colonial fort by looking through aerial photos. And then he also found like ancient houses and household artifacts. Just overall, he was really good at finding just different random like ancient things. And I thought that was kind of funny. But I think it was kind of cool how he found the map on the rock and how he saw that the rock had been napped. So he was curious as to what was on it and looked at it, and then ended up splashing water on it, which made the art pop out really well. And so it was like a map, and then there was like a few other things like drawn on or pecked into it. So they used like a sharp tool to like peck into the rock, and they thought maybe that it was used to like mark some, maybe like an end of a territory, or like marked where people lived, or just different things like that. I think it was really cool how there's different things that it could mean, and how people are still trying to figure out what exactly it all means. And overall, I just thought this chapter was really cool because it showed like how different things were made, like the maps, how they were on the rocks. And then it said like later tribes put the maps on like the hides of animals. And yeah, overall I just think it's really cool how different everything can be but similar at the same time, especially with the maps that were mentioned in this chapter. I just finished chapter 12, and one thing that stuck out to me was how they said the Cahokians had most likely changed how, like, war and violence were used, like, against different tribes. I thought it was interesting how they said that they might have even used the game of Chunky to resolve their like differences or conflicts instead of trying to battle it out and like kill each other. They might have just played the game and had the winner take all. I also thought it was interesting how they used like strategic violence. They might have used strategic violence to keep the peace with other tribes and just almost like scare them into following their rules or just scare them into not being like causing conflict. Overall, after reading this book, it really like opened my eyes to what actually could have been in North America before settlers moved here or before even the Native Americans I had learned about already. And I didn't even realize that this big city was in St. Louis, just a few hours away from me, and how there's still like ancient artifacts being found, and how we can go visit this. I had no idea that this even existed, so it was really cool to learn about all the different things that this one city may have done to really just change how people lived back then, and it even influences how we live today and how um, like impactful this city was, even though it was only there for what, like the 200 years, did it say? Maybe a little longer. But overall, I just thought it was super interesting how this one city had such a big impact on like life back then and even life today.